Hey there, I'm Ryan. Welcome to today's acrylic landscape lesson. All of the tools and materials will be listed in the video description. And if you'd like help with the drawing process, I will have the traceable up over on Patreon along with the reference photo for color matching. If you're interested, check it out. But with that, let's jump into it and have some fun. So I'm going to start here with the 1-inch flat-headed brush, as I do want something quite large to block in the sky. I'm going to dip the bottom third of it in a little bit of water just to help ensure that the bristles do stay condensed and it keeps the paint wet for a longer period of time. But with that, when we look at our palette here, we have 3 different pigments. I have a titanium white, a Mars black, and finally an ultramarine blue, and I will have the images up on screen of the tubes so you know exactly what I'm using. That said, we are going to start by grabbing quite a lot of our titanium white. We'll grab about 1/10 that with the corner of our brush in Mars black and mix that up. That way we don't have something too stark. And then finally, we'll go and grab about 1/5 ultramarine blue and work that in there as well. Do a nice mix, that way we don't have some areas that are a little darker, some areas that are a little bit more blue, and we'll go into the top of the painting and start working this into all of the open areas in the sky. Now I can already tell that it's a little bit darker than what I want it to be in the end. So in my next mixture, I'm just going to use slightly less Mars black and slightly less blue. Now we have something really nice and bright. And we are going to have to go back and do 2 to 3 layers on just about everything anyway. So don't worry if the first color isn't absolutely perfect. Though you can always just head on over to the reference photo and do a direct test there. That said, I think this is turning out really well. I'm going over the edges of a lot of the trees on the side, because generally we want to place our trees on top of the sky, on top of the background, and it's just a lot easier to go over them a little bit. Now, while the majority of the sky is seen through here, you can see just a little bit of it showing through the trees, and it's important that we don't miss that as well. Now we already have all of our paint mixed, so it should be nice and easy. And we're not going to move it down too far. We also don't have to be too precise. You're going to have areas in between. But much like this side, we do want to give it 2 layers, and it looks like my latest mixer is a little bit bright, so we can just make it a little bit darker. Just add some blue, some Mars black, and we'll get it there. Now, when we look at our reference photo, you can see that all of that backing foliage is actually more of a blue than it is a green, and we want to get a bit of a darker blue. And this is all occurring, of course, because we have just some cooler light in the background, those cooler shadows, and it creates a really nice contrast with the warmer pigments that we have up here where the light does hit. But with that, we are going to try to match that color. We're going to start with quite a bit of our ultramarine blue, slightly less, maybe about 2/3 in our Mars black, because Mars black is just such a strong pigment, and then maybe 1/5 that in our titanium white. And as you can see, we have a really nice dark rich blue, probably too dark. We'll go in with a little bit of a test. Far too dark. So we'll double up our titanium white, but when we add that titanium white, we also desaturate the pigment. So we might have to go back in with more blue to add that saturation, because the white and the black do make it more of a gray, still too dark. Yet again, more white. And you'll notice that I'm very slowly adding the white pigment to this. I really don't want to overdo it at any point. And we just get a much better idea of how to mix our colors correctly when we do take our time, rather than just randomly allocating a lot to the mix. Now, that is the correct value, but it's a little too desaturated. We added too much white and black to the blue, so we'll add in our blue yet again, but not a massive amount. And we'll just keep testing until we get exactly what we want. Often the best way of doing this. And that right there is actually quite perfect. So, very happy with it. Once we apply this, we can go in with the very subtle greens and some highlights, but let's get our base layer on there first. So, jumping back into this, we'll grab our pigment and we're going to very specifically start over here on the left-hand side. I'm going to work with the sharp edge of my brush to create that nice bottom portion. We'll work up our more prominent foliage. Apply a little bit of pressure, but not so much that we're ripping the paint off from other areas. We really do want to ensure that we have a nice thick application. Grab a bit more water just to keep it nice and damp, so we can continuously blend with the previously applied portions. And now when we meet the sky, I'm going to do a bit of a tap. I'm going to rotate my brush a little bit. That way we get a nice soft segmented transition rather than a hard line. It can look like the top of foliage, though we will cover the majority of this a little bit later anyway, so it doesn't have to be perfect. With that, go back, grab more, and I'm probably going to end up covering a lot of the trees and whatnot, but if there are a couple prominent ones, you can just work your way around them, as I did there. And I'm working in a bit of an X-shaped pattern because it moves the paint not only left and right, not only up and down, but all four of those directions. Then I'm going to go back up and make this area just a little bit more randomized because it did have a bit of a hard line, something we are trying to avoid. And we're going to create a bit more of a staggered effect from the more opaque pigment to the more semi-transparent. Now we are starting to run out of paint, but it's actually a good time to do so because as we get closer to the right-hand side, we move farther away from the light. The light isn't actually directly hitting this area, but you are going to get some of that reflective light from your other subjects. So as you move farther and farther to the right here, we're going to actually want to start incorporating a little bit more Mars black into the mixture. So I'm going to remix our pigment, but slightly darker than it was before. And I'm trying to do this relatively quickly while that's still wet. But if it does dry, that's okay. We can always go back and remix the previous color as well. Just create a bit of a transitionary area. But with that, we have a large tree here. Normally, again, I don't mind painting over them because we can always just redraw them, but I think we'll probably just go about it like this. I'm going to do a bit of a tapping, rotating, using mostly the corners so that I don't have hard lines. And again, that X-shaped pattern really helping fill in the rest of this, blending into our previous areas because it's still semi-wet, because our brush is damp. And we're talking a lot about how damp the brush is and the benefits of that, obviously. Though it definitely does thin the paint, and that is one of the reasons why we normally want to do 2 to 3 layers, which is something I'll definitely be doing with this, though I'm not going to film all of them, much like I'm not going to film the secondary and third layers of most of our subjects, just because we don't really need the lesson to be 3 times as long just to repeat the same information. Occasionally, I will do the same thing a couple of times on camera, just to ensure that it does, stick and resonate for future paintings. That way these ideas don't only help you with this one, but also help you with your future endeavors. But with that, for the most part, whenever I do something, I do recommend going back and doing a second or a third layer. Exact same way, just adding more paint. And when I'm closer to the top, I'm going with the brighter mixture because that foliage will be a little bit brighter naturally. Here I'm covering up some of the tree, but that's okay. We know where it is. There we go. And there are some thin areas, so I'm going to let this dry. Going to come back in, do the second layer, and then I will see you for some of the fun details. Now, as you can see, we do have some very subtle hints of green around the bottom area, the areas that are protruding, getting closer to us, and therefore reaching more of this light that's streaming down, and that's our next step. So I have some sap green right here on the palette. You can see the one that I opted to use right here, and we're going to mix right beside this pigment because it's essentially going to be going on top, and we want to ensure that it works well together. So it's going to be a bit of a cool green. We will grab about 1/5 of what we have for green in our blue and mix that in as well. Then we'll probably need to darken it a little bit, so we'll grab a hint of Mars Black. Very, very minimal amount, at least initially. You can see I'm taking off a lot of the excess just around the rest of the palette, and some titanium white. The titanium white and the Mars Black will of course mix to make more of a gray, and that's important because at this point we really desaturated the blue, but we didn't desaturate the green yet. So I'm just going to continuously add very minor amounts of these two, just like that, and that looks really nice actually. That works really well beside the blue. So we'll do a little test, and it is far, far too dark. It looks great on here, but sometimes those looks can be a little deceiving. So we'll just go in with a bit more titanium white, brighten it up, and it's still not bright enough. One more time maybe? That looks great. Okay, we found something that works really well. And so we'll switch our brush and head in to the canvas. Now, for the next application, we are going to switch over to our fan brush, as it has a bunch of little bristles which would be great for rendering randomized foliage, and they're all just so small, so we'll be able to get really tiny markings. With that, I will load up that brush, really try to get pigment on all of the ends, and then I'm going to start by defining the more prominent bushes. And you can kind of see that there's a little bit of a darker spot here at the bottom. I did that earlier just to kind of give myself a little indication of where I wanted this to be. And I'm just going to work on the top of where this bush is going to eventually stand, and then I'll work my way down and let the pigment dissipate so we get the brightest marking on the top, the most notable, and then it slowly dissipates as it kind of descends and receives a less light. There we go. We can also rotate our brush to get more of a randomized application. And what we're not looking for here is straight lines. So you can see that I'm also rotating my brush to be more vertical occasionally. And I'm not pressing the entirety of the brush into the canvas. I'm trying to be much more careful than that. Here you can see this all rises up. It creates a bit of a leading line that brings you in towards the middle of the canvas. I'm leaving little open areas as well. And as we really do run out, I'll work my way upwards, still keeping in mind occasional mounds of foliage, little clusters. But right now we're essentially just adding a little bit of highlighted texture to the background to make it more interesting in the areas that do show through. The majority of this will be covered. However, that isn't all of it. And with that, when I do go back and grab more paint, generally my first couple of taps are going to be in a pre-established area just to get some of that paint off of the brush. And then once that's done, we'll move more out into the negative space, all of the open area, and just continue. So we have new paint. We'll work that off in a good spot here and there. Maybe create some extra prominent pieces as we continue, and we're taking it really slow. So we have time to kind of analyze the areas where we might want more to be, where we need to kind of stay away from, where if you go in with a lot and you try to get it done really quickly, you kind of forfeit a lot of that choice. And I think you can really create some beautiful things when you do take your time. I know sometimes I get comments saying, I clicked on this video and then I realized it was like 2 hours long, which is understandable. These are quite long normally, but I just try to give you as much information as I can. Take things slow, that way you do them right. And with that, here you can see we're really working our way up. Lots of texture. Lots of rotating brush marks. Also, don't forget to take a couple steps back from your canvas occasionally, just to make sure that everything is cohesive. You don't have any areas that you've missed. Sometimes when you're really up close, it's difficult to distinguish, but taking those steps back can really give you a proper, fresh perspective. I'm going to do just that, and if I need to go back in and add any more little details like that, I'll do so, but in general, I'm actually quite happy with this backing. Remember, it will have light coming, streaming in, it will have trees, it will have a lot of foliage and trees in the foreground covering it. So we don't want it to be too complicated because we don't want it to become distracting later on. Also, it is quite a bit farther away, so you're inherently not going to see that much detail within it. It's important to recognize that some areas of your painting need to look a bit more simplified so that other areas can stand out and really achieve that natural realism. Now for the next step, we'll be switching to the 1/3 inch filbert brush, as it has a nice sharp top, but also rounded corners which are great for blending. Now, things do get a little loud, so I'm going to dub the next 7 minutes. But with that, I do have some burnt umber, which you can see right here on the screen. And it is the newest addition to our palette. We're going to be using that for the tree branch, but we are going to start with some Mars black and about an equal mixture of that burnt umber. Then we are going to grab just a hint of titanium white. We really don't want much, but we just want to desaturate the brown a hint, especially for this first application. And when I go for the test, I realize it's the correct value, but it could be a little bit more brown, so we re-interject that back into the mixture. And from there, I feel like, you know what? It's quite close. It's a little reflective, so it's difficult to tell the actual hue. Though if you kind of move around your setting, you can kind of deal with that, and as it dries, you can tell that it's quite close. That said, I'm also mixing a bit of a darker blue, so darker than the actual background, and this is going to be for those trees that we have in the distance that have that cool blue light on them, and I figured we'd just tackle both different types of tree trunks at the same time. They're different hues, but they're applied in the same way with the same brush, so it's just convenient to get it all done in that same step. And with that, because we were just working with the blue, we are going to start there. I left a little bit of an opening here on the canvas, and we are going to go in with a bit of water on our brush. It's going to thin the pigment, so we'll have to do multiple layers, but it is going to give us a much sharper application, which is really important for trees and their edges. We did switch to the filbert brush here because it does have that nice sharp edge, and it's going to make our job a little bit easier. Also worth noting, these trees are slightly more desaturated than the blue in the background, and it's also slightly darker for that first layer. But the second one, we are grabbing some titanium white, interjecting that into our mixture, and I don't want it to become too bright, so I grab a hint of black. But now I start to apply some light to the side of the tree, which is facing the light. The light is going to be on the left-hand side, so we're going to have it slowly wrap around. And there are going to be two trees, so here I'll separate them as well. It isn't a light that's kind of emanating from the middle of the singular tree. It's two trees, one of which is slightly in front of the other, creating a little bit of extra depth. But you don't have to settle for those first applications. You can go back to your palette, as I am here, interject a little bit of that darker mixture back in there, and we can kind of bounce back and forth between the brighter and the darker. Normally, our tree trunks, things of this nature, have a lot of texture in them, a lot of tapping, but I am avoiding that in these specifically because they are farther away. You're not going to see that detail, But now I'm going back to our more earthy mixture, quite a bit of Mars Black, again, even-ish mixture of the burnt umber, if not just a little bit more, hint of titanium white. And now we have this nice desaturated pigment for the foreground. We are moving out of the background. It means we no longer have that cool shadow pigment working its way over all of the subjects. This is more so out in the light. And we're applying this with a bit of water on our brush. We do still want those very clean lines, and whenever you're working on a larger tree, I do recommend working on both of the edges first and then going back into the center of it as you start to run out of paint, because often when you initially grab water and paint, your brush has the greatest opportunity to render detail, and the longer that you work with that brush before going back and grabbing more water and paint, the more difficult it is to render those sharper lines. Now here at the top, it isn't all that large, so I can do so with singular strokes. But when you do find yourself in a larger body of a tree, do remember that same thing goes for rocks or anything with a sharper surface. Now, I do have a fairly good recollection of where my branches are going to be, so I'm just going to sketch them in, though you are more than welcome to use the reference photo, the traceable, all of that good stuff up over on Patreon. But I am going to have to go back and do a secondary layer over a lot of this, though right now we're not looking for a perfect application. We're just trying to get an idea of where our tree is going to be, as we're going to start incorporating light for our next step, and we're going to make some decisions as to if the light overlaps the majority of the tree, different portions, and I just want the base. I want the main body to make those decisions. So we're not going to be doing elaborate branches right now. We're not going to be doing foliage. We just want to know where the primary pieces are, everything that keeps it sturdy. And with that, we're also going to get close. We'll do a couple small branches just to, again, get an idea of how it's all going to move and work. But nothing minute. We're not switching to a smaller brush. If it's not achievable with the filbert, we're not doing it at all. So I'm pretty happy with that. Now, while we wait for that to dry, we're going to prep what's next, and we're going to be using a round-headed brush. It can have a point at the top, but you really just want to ensure that the sides are nice and soft for a subtle blend, because we are going to start working on the light. Which light? Well, this light right here coming from the top, as you can see, it moves this way, moves that way, that way, that way, that way. So it's not all moving in the same direction. There's a bit of rotation to it. And I'm going to use this because it's going to give me those soft blended edges that we are going to need. Now I'll start with some titanium white, and we'll just mix it right over here. We are going to recreate the color of the sky. So we'll grab a little bit of our ultramarine blue and our Mars black. If you still have the pigment on your palette, you can just mix to that. I am going to be remixing it, and I can tell that it does need to be quite a bit more bright, and maybe a hint more blue. That looks quite nice. And go in for a little test. Looks great, so we'll test it on the canvas as well. That said, make sure your brush is nice and damp, as you are going to want these pigments to be semi-transparent, and the water will help with that. So we'll grab a little bit of that pigment, and we're going to start by, first of all, testing the pigment. So I'll find an area that I'm pretty confident will get covered up eventually. That did end up turning out well. So now I'm going to just, with my arm, make the suggestive markings that I'm going to, just so I have an idea. I have a little bit of practice with my movement. That way I go in with the correct trajectory. You can of course draw it on with Conte or something of that nature, but I feel like I have a good indication of what I want. I'm going to start right here. And I just worked my way down. Now I'm going to continue to get that pigment off. And you can even get a lot of it off down here. Doesn't really matter. We're going to cover that up. But now we go into the sides with the edge of our brush, which is rounded. It's going to soften things, give us a bit of a gradient so that the center is the most opaque, and then as we move out towards the sides, it becomes lesser and lesser. Now, it's going to take a little bit of practice. You can even use your finger to soften it to a greater degree. Just going to add a little bit of water to make it slightly more malleable. And I'm trying to stay consistent, or relatively consistent with my movements. But we'll continue on to the next one. And it'll look a whole lot more natural as we continue and we go back and we thicken the middles. But I don't want to thicken the middle just yet, because often when pigment is wet, and then you go to apply more pigment on top of it, it almost ends up ripping off the previous layer. So when you're working with a lot of water, as we are here, and you want to do multiple layers, often the best way of going about it is just letting it dry, trusting the process, and then coming back to it a little bit later. And this is essentially a bit of a glaze, in that we're not really applying much paint at all, and we're just getting this heightened value over our pre-existing application. So you can still see the initial painting. You can still see the detail underneath the light. It's not too much, and I'm going to take off some of the excess. That's something I wish I did with this first application. I wish I took off a little bit of the excess down here, so I do recommend that. But again, we'll make it look a bit more cohesive. There are ways of kind of going back and just making it all work together, but that's a little tip. And here you do have the opportunity to work behind the tree if you like, or in front of it. And that's why we did it first. That way in different areas we could go behind or over, just give us some added variation, make it a little bit more interesting. Going to go over my edge, soften it with the side of the brush, head back up to the top. And if you do go over it and you decide, you know what, I really wish I didn't do that, you can always go back and repaint it. It is essentially just a silhouette. It's easy to work around, should we need to. Now again, we are continuing those general movements. Generally, it's best to kind of pick a spot in the sky where it's all going to come from, and you can even use a ruler or painter's tape. There we go. I'm moving around the tree, but again, you don't have to. There's a lot of room for artistic liberty in this. There we go. Might be easier to go over the tree if you want to ensure that it's a perfect line and you're not taking that break. But I do want this to go over the top area of the tree, I believe. So some of this light will get through, and I'm going to take off some of that excess. And now we'll work it right over there. You can even change the trajectory of the light if you want while it's still so wet. And you can see that I'm doing that a couple of times. There we go. Now hypothetically, this has had a chance to dry, so we'll grab some pigment, head back into the top, work it in the middle, blend it out a little bit, and there is a tiny spot there that you can see it's kind of coming up. Had it been fully dry, that wouldn't have occurred. We can work around it, but I do think I'm going to take a little break and then come back. Okay, so I've given it about 10 minutes just to be sure, and it is fully dry now. So I can head back to my palette, grab more of that mixture. I'm going to go in at the top because the top is going to be the brightest spot, right? And then we'll just work our way down. Let it slowly dissipate. I have more on the brush, so I'll actually move that off elsewhere before we go into blending the edges. And then we'll continue in there. And acrylics are, as you know, semi-transparent. They also dry a little bit darker, so while it may look bright right now, as it begins to dry, it will become more subtle. So here we go. Continuing to soften those edges, keeping it brighter at the top than the bottom. It's a really fun process once you get the hang of it, but it does take a little bit of practice. And if you have another canvas laying around that has a piece that you don't necessarily love and you don't know what to do with it, you might want to practice this on there as well. Just because there is some technique to it. And here you can see I'm continuously reforming different portions, which is great. Grab more, take off the excess, head up to the top of this, and there I did end up going over the branch despite leaving it the first time. Honestly, just forgot, but that's okay, we can go over it. And I think I'll do that here too, just to make it a little bit easier. Grab some additional pigment, just like that. Far too dark, more titanium white, more blue. That's why we add very, very minimal amounts initially, normally. Here you can see I have a bit of a thicker pigment, so I'm just applying it to the tops in the beginning. Now I'll take that pigment off, make my brush a bit more damp, just grab a hint of it, work it out. And now we'll proceed to continue those movements. There we go. These last two are working really nicely because they had a little bit more time to dry than the rest. Though I definitely want to go back and add a bit more of a brightness to the top, and that's not going to be able to occur until this dries. So yet again, we're just going to take a little bit of a break and head back in a little bit. But it's progressively getting there. So I've given it another 10 or so minutes. We'll grab some of that pigment. We'll head up to the top here. Apply it there, 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 and there. We'll take off the excess. Give it just a second to dry so that we don't really take away too much from the middle. And then we'll subtly work our way down. Let it dissipate. And this one, as you can see, is working really well. We've built it up enough that these layers now look really bright. And I think I'm actually going to combine a couple of them slightly. The combination area isn't going to be as bright, but I can tell in the reference photo, this area here in the middle is quite a bit brighter than the rest, and I actually really like it. So we'll just bring these together, grab some more paint, head up to the top, and have some fun. But this is really something you can spend quite a bit of time with just because of the dry time. Perfecting it, making it the way you like. Though, can be a bit of a learning curve. So, remember, practicing on another canvas isn't the worst idea. With that, just so this section doesn't take too long, I think I'll quickly just finish this up. And we can head to the next portion together. So our next step isn't actually to go back to the tree just yet because we're going to want to layer this on top of foliage, which means that foliage is our next step. Now, if you look, a lot of this foliage is lit from the back, so we're actually going to start with the lightest pigment and then work to more of a mid value, and then we'll end on the darker pigment. So what I'm going to do is grab some of that cadmium yellow deep hue, grab an equal mixture of our sap green. We'll work those two together, make it a nice warm green, and that's why we used this yellow particularly. It is a bit of a warmer yellow. Then, of course, we'll add about a third of our titanium white, really brighten it up, desaturate it a bit, and a hint of our Mars Black to further desaturate it. It will darken it to a point. We may want to go back in and re-brighten it, but we'll give it a test. And as you can see, it is far from as bright as what we'd like it to be. So we'll double up on the titanium white. Go back in. Really close. Could be a bit more yellow. Again, a little bit more yellow. Baby steps until we get it right. And I really like that. Yeah, okay, this is great. So now that we have it mixed, we are, yet again, going to switch our brush. Now here we have another fan brush, however this one's much more soft, and as you can tell at the top, it's significantly more uniform. So this is great because when it gets wet, these condense into maybe 10 selections of bristles, and we can use them to create individual little patches of foliage that are slightly larger than what we would have had with the other brush, though we will be using the other fan brush as well. Also worth noting, you don't actually need 2 fan brushes. It gives you a little bit of extra option, a little bit of extra detail to play with, but it's not necessary. Just recognize that the first one we played with was a bit more stiff, and this one's a bit more soft, if you do have or want the variance. So here we have a fairly wide shot of the canvas because we do want to ensure that we have the top area to work on. I have my brush currently. As you can tell, it is still dry. I'm going to dip it in a little bit of water, and when I show it to you again, it's going to look very different. Now, as you can see, it has multiple heads. The bristles have started to clump, and each of those will render their own little individual marking. So with that, head back to my palette, grab some of our pigment. It's really just on the tips of the bristles. And now we're going to paint where in the end we want our foliage to be. I'm going to rotate my brush quite a lot through this process. And it's something that we want to have is fairly randomized. So I'm going to try to stand a bit farther back as I go through this process, just so I'm not too much kind of in my own head trying to make something particular happen. And as we rotate, you can tell that we get leaves that look like they're all working in different directions. We want to keep a lot of openings. You want to create individual clusters. I am looking at the reference photo, though I am also going to deviate just so that we can take some artistic liberties and have fun with it. I'm also going to cover up fair portions of our tree and not worry too much about that. We can always go back and paint the tree, the branches, all of that over top of these, and that's actually why we didn't paint many branches initially, because we were going to do this and we were going to need to cover a lot of it up. So we just saved ourselves some time and decided to wait to do the branches. There we go. Working my way up. I don't think I'm going to keep the top left-hand corner as busy as it is in the reference photo, but I am going to have quite a bit of foliage up here, particularly in the top right-hand corner. I'm going to create a bit of a vignette, that way we can draw the eye in. And we are going to add middle values on top of all of these. Or at least a lot of them. So while it looks very visually samey right now, recognize that we are going to be delivering quite a lot of depth in just a little bit. Really like it though. I think it's a great color. I think it stands out really well against the blue. Even some small ones down here. And we'll need some behind, but not too many, because it is a bright pigment, and the light isn't going to get all that far, right? Light's hitting this area, dissipating as it moves over there. There we go. So far so good. Now, I'm going to attempt to use what I have here, add some extra green, add some extra Mars Black, come up with more of a desaturated, mid-value green. And I'm going to leave just a little bit of our initial mixture off to the side. That way we can remix to it if we want to, and we are going to want to. That said, I like the new mix. We'll do a little grab with this. I'll test on the reference photo. It does look good. So now if the light's coming this way, then hypothetically the edges are going to be illuminated, but the backs of each cluster are going to have more pigment. So here's a cluster, and I'm working on the back of it. Same idea as before, lots of little taps, but we're being a bit more mindful of where we're applying them. And we're almost going to have the lighter yellow as a bit of an outline. I'll get you a bit closer for this part though. So here we are, nice and close. Going in for all of my taps. Still leaving little portions of the sky showing through, but not to a great extent. There we go. You also might notice that the room gets brighter and darker. It's one of those days where it's cloudy and then it's not, and then it's cloudy and then it's not, which is actually great for painting. It used to really annoy me because I'd want something consistent so I could consistently see my colors in the same way. But when you think about it, the room in which your painting is going to be in is probably going to have natural light, and you get to see your painting on days that are more cloudy and more sunny all at the same time, so you can kind of work with it with that in mind, which can be really beneficial. So just something else to consider. That said, I don't have much of this darker pigment in the back here, so we'll work that about. Lots of rotations. Definitely going to need to go back and do some more with the actual tree trunk, but that's okay. And we're just about out of paint, so very soon we'll make a bit of a change. And again, I don't think mine is going to be as full as what there is in the reference photo, but that's okay. Switching over to the 1-inch flat-headed brush, Mars Black, green, yellow, about an equal mixture to everything else that we have at this point, and titanium white, because we do need to continue desaturating. We are going to leave the second pigment there, just for reference if we need it again. Dip my fan brush in some water, go back, grab more. Find the backs. And this is going to create more of a body for a lot of it. Really going to make it much more full. Now, the value of this is actually very close to the blue, as you can see, which is nice in that it's cohesive. However, it doesn't really stand out all that much. So I think we're going to go even darker. Do another layer. Often the more layers of these you do, the more natural it ends up looking. So it's not a bad thing. It just takes a little bit more time. That said, we're going to do our due diligence here and still finish up and ensure that we have a good representation of this green throughout. If you find you accidentally cover too much of the yellow, don't worry about that. We are definitely going to go back, and I can see areas through here that I'm really going to want to do, so no worries at all. And I'm not really going to go any farther down than where we already are. So far so good, though I will bring you a little bit farther back just so you can get a larger visual context of how it's all starting to work together. So now our next step is yet again more green, more yellow, and quite a bit more Mars Black. We're progressively making this darker and darker. That's a really nice dark green. We will still use some titanium white. A little bit less every time, but we do need it to desaturate the greens that are inside so that it's consistent with the rest. Switch over to our fan brush, which of course we will make nice and damp. Grab that. Going to start right up here at the top, because I know I do want that area to be relatively dark. And we're going to try to stay, for the most part, within the pre-existing darker areas, just because this is quite dark and it's going to look very, very stark next to either of the first two mixes. So as I was initially noting, take those steps back, that way you get more of a randomized application, you get something that's a bit more natural. This is where you might want to hone in a little bit and just ensure that you get the details that you also really want, that it progresses correctly. There we go. I might move some of the darker shadows, darker foliage farther back down than the light that we were working with, simply because the bottom area isn't going to be receiving much light. It'll be a lot darker. And the lighter pigments just didn't contextually make sense down here at the bottom like the rest of these do. Definitely room to add here. Though the more I add of this, the more I recognize that I am going to want to go back with the highlights. So we will certainly do that. I think I'm also going to soften some of these a little bit more later on, but we'll see we are going to add a lot of foliage on top of them. So it's really dependent. I didn't want to do too much of that, too much blending initially, just because it is about finding that balance, and often in that final 10-15% of the painting we go back and we alter a lot of it. And the less we do, the more room we have to alter, but might actually turn out really well. I have a lot of faith in the painting. It's a beautiful reference photo, and I think we're doing a pretty good job so far. Now, as we get close again, it is evident, especially through here, that we do need more of those highlights, and luckily we did leave that initial color right up here so we can remix to it nice and easy. We of course have a lot of our yellow, more so than in any other mixture, or green or white, and then we do need a hint of that Mars black. But just like that, we were able to find that nice mixture. And again, generally when it takes you a little while to get to those mixtures the first time, you retain it more and it's easier to remix. So don't get frustrated if you don't get it on the first mix. Often it ends up helping you later on. But with that, we're going to go back in and re-interject some of this brightness along the edges, initially at least, but also in some of the inner portions where perhaps the light's coming down, it misses some of the clusters, there are some openings, and then it has an opportunity to present itself in the light right down here. So we'll just work this around a lot of these. Really lovely. There we go. Might tap on a new cluster just through the back of here as I run out of paint, because hypothetically, while it should get darker as it moves this way, you are still going to have some that protrude out and catch a light, because as it comes down, it's going to work its way around and through these, and because this one's farther out, the back of it isn't going to block it to the same extent. And little things like that are good to take into account. There we go. It's looking really full now. Nice and three-dimensional. Just took some layering, some caution, some initial more cathartic movements. Again, we started taking those steps back, getting it more randomized, and then we slowly honed in. I love painting trees. I find it so much fun. That said, we can go for an even brighter highlight, but I think, you know what, I think we should do it. Yeah. Just make it a little bit brighter than we did before. Very easy to do. Just grab, hint more white and yellow. We'll be very sparing with it. I thought about waiting, and we could, but when we apply the other tree on the other side, it's going to cover up portions of this, and going in and doing this will be significantly more difficult. So better to do it now, layering process wise. Not too much, just enough to add slightly more variance. Now we're going to switch over to a smaller liner brush, as we do have some branches to recreate. So now we're going to jump back into these, and I'll start with the burnt umber, about half that in Mars Black, just because it's a stronger pigment, smallest hint of titanium white to desaturate it, and maybe just a hint more Mars Black. So with that, back to the canvas. So I ended up redrawing in a lot of my branches using a little bit of Conte, spelled C-O-N-T-E. It's essentially just a chalk, but it comes off with water, and it's great because you can allocate different colors to things. But with that, I am going to re-grab that newly mixed pigment. The branches that are closest to the tree are going to be the largest, so you can apply a little bit more pressure with your brush when you're closer to the tree, and then as you move farther away, you apply less and less, and if all goes well, your stroke, your application, gets smaller and smaller. You can also start from the farthest area, and if you are using Conte, you don't have to cover up the entirety of the initial line, because you can just take it off a little bit later with some additional water. But with that, we are going to want to go over these at least twice, just to make sure they're nice and thick. We start with our largest branches, and then we slowly work our way towards the smaller ones. And the larger ones are more about creating homes for all of the individual little clusters. And then the smaller pieces are more aesthetic, things to add to the realism of the piece. Though realistically, you want them all to serve a purpose. So to work one group of foliage into another, and I think it's going really, really well. There we go. Create lots of little spin-offs. Have them going in and out of the clusters, so we have a lot of weaving happening. We'll work on it, and then we'll take it off, and then we'll work on it, and we'll take it off. Now, when we get closer, things are admittedly going to look a little bit more messy, but we will clean them up as the painting continues to progress. I love to show you shots like this, so that you're aware that if it does look messy, not your fault, part of the process. It's how acrylic painting works. It's all about layering and trusting that you can get it to a good place with more layers in time. So with that, while it does look messy, I think it's actually in a great place for progression. And speaking of progression, we're going to grab some of our titanium white, work that into our previous mixture, grab some extra burnt umber, and create a bit of a brighter mix than what we previously had. You can tell that it's more rich, and the light's coming in this way, so the left-hand side of our tree will hypothetically have some extra color to it. It'll be a bit brighter. Won't all be this one singular shadow, right? So I like to start on the edge, the left-hand edge, and then I'll work my way inwards, doing a tap and drag effect, and I'm getting a bit of a gradient, which is nice, though you don't actually have to. You can get more of that speckled, dotted look. And I say dotted, it's still done through elongated strokes, but that will just add pattern and texture, and it really isn't a bad thing. So it's subtle with the first application. We go back, we can add it to the tops of these larger branches, especially where they'll be receiving light. There we go. And now, yet again, we grab some extra titanium white, work that into our previous mixture. We're just slowly building it up. Go in with lots of little taps. And this is actually quite stark. You don't have to make it as stark. It's definitely not the stark in the reference photo. But I love the wood texture and the detail. And we can always make it darker again if we don't end up loving it. Here, working it on the tops of the branches. This is only in areas that the light will work its way through, so you don't have to follow the entirety of the tree. There we go. Getting a little bit quiet just because it's very detail and focus oriented. You can see all of the little taps that are occurring. Now I'm applying almost no pressure with my brush. Now, getting that close again can be a little awkward because it's, oh, I need to fix that little thing, that little thing, that little thing. It can get daunting. But again, we trust the process, and in that process, I did realize that I do want these to be a little bit brighter. And now is the opportune time to do that before we start applying all the foliage on this side, which will also cover it up. So I'm back to the round-headed brush. I'm going to grab our titanium white, and here we have our previous mixture, but it's pretty close to other wet pigments. So we'll just start a brand new one right down here. It's really not a hard mix, it's a little bit of blue. It's quite a lot of titanium white, and it's the smallest hint of Mars black. Though we do take off our excess. Things ended up being a little bit darker than we wanted. Add more titanium white. And because we added more white and black, we need to add a little bit more blue, just to give it the saturation back. So, now we have what we want. We'll do a little test in an area that doesn't matter too much, right up here, just because we'll cover a lot of that with foliage. It is good, so I'll head back up to the tops of my trees and I'll work this in. Now I really want this to be quite a bit brighter, so I'm actually not using much extra water on the brush like I was previously. So we'll just apply that at the top. We'll let it dry just a little bit. That way, when we blend it out, we don't take all of it. So just giving it a couple seconds, and now we go back. Grabbing from the top, doing that blend down. We ended up having really good timing. There we go. And because there's not a lot of water in this mixture, unlike the others, we can actually go back and grab more paint and apply it much more safely than we were in previous applications. There we go. Definitely getting there. Going for some elongated strokes. With a lot of the tree, it's a lot of tap and drag. Here I am trying to go the distance, and I'm just lifting the brush off as we get towards the bottom so it softens. Gets more transparent, we get more of a gradient. And there's a bit of a combination in the middle here so that we don't have a bunch of rays of essentially the same size coming down. I just saw it in the reference photo and I realized, we should really continue to play with that because it's a great look. There we go. If it becomes too much, we can just work our way back up with our fingers, take a little bit of that paint off. Really, really happy with it though. There we go. And foliage will cover the majority of the left-hand side, but we might as well make it look fairly pretty anyway. Now, before we start working in this bottom area and on all of these bushes, we need to work on the ground itself so that we can layer these on top of it because they do physically sit on top of it. So, with that in mind, we're going to look at this and we're going to start by creating the darkest base layer. So, I look at that and I say, you know what, it's probably right around there. We need some green. We need a little bit of burnt umber. It's a bit earthy, it's a bit warmer. We'll probably also grab some of our yellow, as you can see, just right at the top there. Mars black, of course, because it's going to be darker. And I'm covering a lot of the greens, but I do have just the hint of them on the side, so that's okay. We'll also grab a little bit of titanium white. Go in for a little test. And I think that's actually a little bit darker than it should be. Add more titanium white. Make it more earthy yet again. Remember, we are going to be adding a lot of pigment on top of this, so it can be not the most aesthetic color to begin with, honestly. A little bit more Mars black. And I think that'll actually work great. So, let's mix a bit more of that and head into our canvas. Now, we've been working with a lot of detail and whatnot, but this next step, very easy. Very cathartic. And it's just going to be blocking in the bottom areas of all of our grass. So we'll just work this all the way to the back. I will cover the edges of our drawn on bushes. And if you completely cover them, don't worry about it. You can always go back and redraw. There we go. Remember, we do have the traceables as well as the reference photos for color matching up over on Patreon. It's a great way to support the channel if you can, but if you can't, it's also a-okay. Though I would also like to note, you can also find all of my ebooks, including Acrylics for Beginners, which is essentially the essentials, everything you need to know about acrylic painting. Up there, you can get a bunch of ebooks full of traceables, access to our exclusive Facebook group where people share their artwork and we get to kind of go over it. It's neat because it's always based on similar paintings for the most part, so you get to see different iterations and get ideas and whatnot. But again, also just a great way to support the channel. Don't feel pressured though. If you can't do it, that's entirely reasonable. We have a great community up there that is taking care of, you know, what we do. And I'd also like to say a big thank you to all of the patrons up there who do make this happen. I really couldn't do this without your support. So thank you for providing me with the opportunity to make these longer, more in-depth lessons, which won't get as many views as the shorter 10 to 20 minute videos, but you know, I think we'll have a lot more information and something that I really want to put out there, and I'm very grateful that you provide me with the opportunity to do so. So thank you for making these videos and this channel happen and continue to happen. But with that, this is well applied. You might want to do a second layer if you can still see portions of the canvas showing through. I'm going to leave it for now. I'm going to let it dry, and then we'll come back in with some of the more fun highlights and mid values. Now, while we wait for all of that to dry, we will head in and start working on the different colors, hues, values that we have down here. And you can tell that they're all brighter than what we have. I'm going to start with this more mid-green, and I'm actually going to mix with the previous mixture just because we already know that it's working in the right direction, and by working beside it as well, we get to make sure that it's cohesive. So we'll start by adding a lot more green. It's actually quite warm being in the foreground, so we'll double up on our yellow, add a little bit more yellow than we have sap green, work that in. We'll do a test, though I think we are still pretty far off. And as you can see, most certainly still pretty far off. We'll add some extra Mars black. We definitely need to desaturate it and darken it a little bit. The Mars black will do both, though there's a fair chance we will still need some extra titanium white to continue desaturating it. It will brighten it, which isn't something we necessarily really want, but we can always just add more Mars black. And I think the more we do this, the more it naturally works with what we have there, which is nice. Oh, that's much better. Much, much, much better. It's a little bit more desaturated there. It's a little bit warmer. Going to add some of our burnt umber, make it a bit earthy. I like that. And while we're at it, I also want to mix some of the yellow and green that we have. So, yet again, I'm just going to move that off to the side, double up our yellow, grab an equal mixture of the titanium white. There we go. Do a little test. Far too dark now. So you can see that there's a real contrast between those two. More yellow, more white. That's really nice for the mid value there. There's a little hints of it showing through. And then we also need the brightest pigment. So move this brighter color off to the side a little bit more. We'll move that. You don't always have to mix just one color at a time. You can go for 2 or 3, especially if they're very cohesive and they're going to be working together. There we go. Going for a little test. Needs to be far more yellow. You know what? I think we'll probably use this as our initial yellow, despite the fact that it's a lot darker, and then we'll build on top of it, just to give us a little bit more option. Yeah. Okay. We don't have that yellow. We will go back and find it, but there isn't much point in continuously mixing in this because there's so much paint here that to get it to be brighter and more yellow, it would just take so much, and it'd be better to use what we have, let it dry, come back and mix that when it's fresh and when we can grab much more accurate proportions. So now that we have everything mixed, we are going to go back to our fan brush. This one is a bit more stiff so we can get the really sharp markings on the canvas. And I will begin with the darkest mixture that we ended up rendering. Now I'm going to start down in the right hand corner. Lots and lots of little taps, though there is a hint of a drag, so I'm not just creating dots. I'm creating little markings which could imply actual grass. Just like that. I did not dampen my brush, that way my bristles were as sharp as possible. And we're just going to continue moving throughout the painting, but predominantly in the areas that we saw in the reference photo that are a little bit darker, don't have that direct light on them. Though we can always go back in and add more highlight on top of this and just create added texture and detail. So it's not a big deal either way. That said, if we can kind of section things off earlier rather than later, we'll make our job a little bit easier, right? Means we'll have to do less problem solving later on. So still lots of taps and drags. You can rotate your brush if you'd like. If you feel like it's getting too visually samey, we are avoiding lines, so I'm never pressing the entirety of the brush in. Now in the background here, I'm going to make my applications much more tightly because we're not going to be able to see detail that far off. And then as I move forward, I'll start letting there be more openings within that grass. That said, we're going to have to add a lot of highlights into this back area, so we'll cover up most of it anyway. There we go. Have a little bit more shadow in there. Now we'll move to the second pigment, a little bit brighter. And this will be somewhat in between our highlights and our shadows, though as it dissipates, I'm going to move much more so over the shadowy areas. I'm going to start expanding it out, though I'm not going to expand it out too much, right under where our bushes are going to be, because they themselves are going to cast shadows. And we can help continue to apply those shadows by simply keeping it more as negative space. There we go. Starting to look nice. Definitely needs more layers, but that is acrylic painting. And it's a really strong technique. Really fun one as well. Just take some of that pigment off my brush, grab more, keep it nice and fresh, nice and sharp. Really just trying to use about 1/3 of the brush, space-wise. There we go. And now by going over everything when I have almost no pigment, we can really tie it all together, take out some of that really stark contrast that we didn't necessarily need, and it helps unify things. Here we go. Go back, grab more, head into the distance where things are more tight. You can leave little openings and lines and spots to show that the ground isn't perfectly flat, that it moves up and down, and therefore some areas get more shadows than others. And I actually am going to move this over all of our negative space in the middle where we're going to do the highlights, just so that we have something to build on top of. Now we'll head to our first round of highlights, but not our true highlights because we weren't able to mix to that simply because we just had too much of the darker pigments already in our mixture, and it would take too much paint to get there naturally. So we'll go in with our first pass. Some lights coming through here, illuminating this middle section. Then it takes a little bit of a break, but then we see it again back here, right around this tree. And again, not doing too much underneath either of these. There's a little bit of a darker spot. I'm going to attempt to keep that. We'll also grab it and do a little opening here and there out in the grass. There were two that I saw in the reference photo that I really liked. And I think when we do more of the branches and the light coming through, it'll visually have a bit more context. There we go. It's definitely coming along. You can see some extra light in the reference photo over here as well. Though if anything it gets too bright, you can always go back in with a darker pigment. There we go. Really nice. Great start. So, with that, we've had some time for everything to dry. I'm just going to grab my 1-inch brush. Make sure it's a little bit more damp. Grab our yellow, and we'll mix it right over here on the palette. We definitely want to mix it in a clean spot. Grab some titanium white. You can tell already just how much brighter this is than that. Grab a little bit of our green, but not much. We want this to be nice and yellow, nice and warm, nice and bright. More titanium white. Beautiful, really beautiful. And from there, we'll switch back. Now this brush does still have the other greens on it, but the majority of the pigment will be this really nice bright yellowish green, and it'll get the job done. And if it doesn't, we can always just do another layer, and it'll look even better for it. There we go. Really looks like we have some light coming in from that middle section. Then tapering off, getting a little darker before it meets the next opening. And you know what? It's not in the reference photo, but I think I want the backing here to have some light. Taking those artistic liberties. Yeah, I like that a lot. Makes it look like it's raised, and then there's a little bit of a fall off, and then there's extra distance before we get to here. I think it gives the painting a bit more depth. There we go. Yeah, that worked great. Going back in, doing a little bit more. And we may go back later once we've done more with the trees, though I would like to note that you can take the middle to more highlighted pigments and work this onto the tree as smaller little pieces of foliage, and it actually works really, really nicely. You don't have to, but if you do it in one area, try to do it in quite a few, just so that it feels really nice and cohesive. But it's an easy way to get a lot of extra detail into a previously created subject. And I actually really like it on here. Also ties the grass and the light in the grass in with the tree. Though you do want these applications to be relatively thick because we have blue going on behind the green. And what do blue and green? Or we have blue behind the yellow. What do blue and yellow normally make? I already spoiled it. It's green. So despite the fact that the blue is already dried, optically you're going to have the blue show through the yellow, which can create a green if the yellow isn't thick enough. So just something to consider, but doing a couple layers here, and I really love how this little test here ended up turning out. So I'm really applying quite a bit of it. Though, again, because we're doing this, I am going to have to go up into the top and add some more. That way we have it in a similar size. Now, we don't have to spend a lot of time doing this, and I almost like to look for the areas that are already a little bit dark, so these will be a bit more stark, a bit more noticeable, so you don't have to do as many because it's already quite visually prevalent. And so I really like those. We'll do a bit over here, predominantly in the areas where the light is hitting. It's nice and warm. It's a little bit brighter, a little bit warmer than anything else we have. And just like that, I think it's enough for now. We might go back and add more later, depending on how this tree goes, but this is another great example of the fact that we're never really done any subject. So if it looks a little bit rough, don't worry, we'll probably come back to it and continue adding. But with that, it's time for the next step. Now, before we get back to the actual trees, we are going to have some fun with the bushes here, here, and here. We have 3 of them, which makes it nice and dynamic, but we're going to start with the darkest base layer, which is almost a black. So we'll grab some Mars Black. We'll grab about an equal mixture of our sap green, just because the black is very, very strong. And then we'll grab a hint of our titanium white. Grab a hint of our yellow, just for a little bit of warmth. And we'll go in for a test. And just like that, I think it's very close. A little bit more Mars Black. And that is exactly what I want. So we'll fill these in, and then we'll work on some detail. Now we're back to yet another very fun, very easy step in blocking in. So with this, generally, I'm going to go to my edges, rotate my brush, and try to get a bit of a sharp movement, so that it implies that of a leaf, a cluster of leaves, something of that nature. And then I fill the middle portion in quite simply. We'll move up. We're a bit farther away now, so the protruding leaves or pieces are going to be smaller. So I'm not creating as much distance between them. I'm not letting them extend to the same degree as what happened out here, and it's Important to always consider that. And then as we get really into the distance, I'm almost having it be a bit more round, but inconsistently round, so it's a bit more bumpy. Now we'll work this forward. Looks good. And I have a lot of pigment on my brush, but not enough on the actual edge of it. So I'm just going to work the middle section in here, and I'll wait to grab some more paint with a bit more of a damp brush for the actual edging. So we switched up the order of things, but for good reason. Grab some more, brush is now more damp, and we are closer than what we have back here, similar to this. So we'll have these protruding pieces, keep them fairly randomized. You could use your filbert brush or your liner brush to do this, but the brush I'm currently using can do it if you articulate your strokes relatively well. There we go. Just adding in lots of little intricacies. And then you can also have those same leaves kind of perch out over top of our now completed grass, and that can make that look a bit more interesting. Grabbing more water from my brush, a very common step as we do more of this. And you can see that there's a lot of rotation occurring. But make sure you do have a lot of paint as you do go through these edges, because they'll look a lot better if they are clean and thick. You don't want any thin applications. And if you can go ahead and get enough paint on there so you don't have to do a second layer, that's also great, because it is more randomized, which makes doing second and third layers a little bit more tricky. It's doable, and you should do it if you feel it's thin, but my goal right now is to make it thick enough that I don't have to. Grab a little bit more water. Head back up to the top. There we go. And this area doesn't matter all that much. We'll do it anyway just to get an impression of where it's going to be, but we're going to cover a lot of this with a tree and some additional foliage, so we'll have to clean it up later anyway. With that, just go over the middle one more time. Make sure that it's nicely applied. And then once this is done, we'll let it dry before we head into our next step. Now, our next step is to work on all of the green foliage that we see throughout here, and it's actually rendered very similarly to the foliage that we have up there. We are going with the 1-inch flat-headed brush because it can just carry a lot of paint, and we'll continue mixing in this general area because we can see how it works with all of our other greens. That said, starting with quite a bit of our sap green, about a third of that in titanium white, we'll start with a third Mars black, and we'll probably have something a bit darker, a bit more desaturated than the actual green. Go in with a little test, and that is actually a fantastic first test there. We'll brighten it up just a hint. A little bit more of that titanium white. Go in yet again, and I'm very, very happy. So, with that, we'll also create a slightly brighter variant. We'll just mix that right up top here. A little bit more titanium white. Some of our yellow. Not quite as bright as the true highlights, but a little bit better. And we can start working this up a little bit higher. So we'll create multiple tiers and we'll continue to build that volume through light. Now, for the actual application process, we are going to be going back to our softer fan brush and make sure that it's nice and damp so that it has the clumped together bristles. Then we'll grab the darker pigment right there, and we'll start actually closer to the top, rotate our brush, create miniature clusters within this larger mass. That means leaving some areas open, while others significantly more full. And there is a lot of space to cover here, so this is another subject where I'd recommend starting a bit farther back, so don't paint too close to the canvas. That way you can incorporate more randomization into the application. And then when you want more form, you can move in closer and connect things in the way that you'd like to. With that, as we continue to move down this larger subject, we start to run out of paint. Our applications become more semi-transparent, so the bottom portion is really the darkest, which is ideal. We've already started to create a little bit of a gradient with light. The application where it's the most thick is at the top, you get the most true green, and then it dissipates and it gets a little bit darker. Though there really isn't much of a contrast between our initial application and this, so it's very subtle, which isn't a bad thing. We'll go again right up here, starting with the most paint, couple clusters, rotating the brush, let it dissipate as we come down. There we go. And I'm also going to take this and do the occasional little tap out in the rest of the grass, so that we have these leaves that have found their way elsewhere. It's a fun little application. I'm doing a little tap and a drag. I'm not going to do too many, but we'll do a couple. There we go. Now we'll head into the back. These are quite a bit farther away, so we're going to clump them together significantly more. Less of an opening in our clusters, but we still want clusters. We still want some open, darker areas, especially towards this back, because we're moving farther and farther away from the light, and it just makes sense that it will be receiving a whole lot less. There we go. That's really nice. Go back to the top here. If we go over the same spot twice, we do make it more prominent visually, because now we're adding green on top of green instead of green on top of almost black. So, with that, now we can go to our brighter pigment, or mix the two together in the middle, just like so. Start yet again at the top, but predominantly closer to the middle because that's where the light's hitting. Rotating our brush, getting those continuously engaging different applications, having it dissipate as you move towards the left here and the bottom. Really don't need much light after this point, but we will have a couple areas that do stick out and catch it. Not many though. And I'm almost out of paint, so now we're on that real left-hand side. Grab more. Start in the center, at the top. Work our way back, work our way down. Rotate, rotate, rotate. And same with the background here, but closer clusters, more overlap, less detail intentionally. There we go. So far, so good. Now we took a little bit of a step back just so we can look at it all very cohesively. We'll grab our highlight, which is going to be much more focused. I'm going to apply it predominantly to the center area, as we talked about. It's where the majority of the light is. And we get less as we start moving back, but it's also at the top. We'll start applying it over here. Really stark, but really nice. Definitely helps blend it in with the rest of the highlights that we have going on in the painting. There we go. And this backing area is definitely going to get quite a few. It's quite prevalent in the reference photo, this area, and the amount of light it has, and I really like it. It almost blends into the background, into the grass, and it just has this really natural look. There we go. Okay, now we're going to have some fun. Switch over to the liner brush, the really small one that we were using previously for details. We'll grab our yellow, white, and a hint of what we were just working with. So we have the brightest mixture yet, the most warm mixture. And we can just do some little taps right here. You can see how it really connects it hue-wise to the grass. We're not going to do too many. They are going to dissipate as you move back. They're not happening farther down. This is really more of a special application. That ends right about there. And if you make it go too far, don't worry about it. You can always go back and cover it up. There aren't many of them, so it's an easy cleanup job. That said, we take it slow. And you probably won't have to. Definitely want to do them in the background. Like I said, it almost connects with the grass visually. This is a big step in making it feel more natural. Admittedly, I do think we have a little bit too much of our clumping going on there, so I'm going to grab some of the darker pigment that we were working with initially, and I'm just going to cut some of these larger areas in half. Just like that. Really simple. Like I said, if you add too much, it's an incredibly easy fix. And you can just paint on additional dark pieces, if you want to, that perhaps you weren't able to get when you were working with the softer fan brush. But yeah, not too much here that I feel like we need to get done. I feel like it worked out pretty well. Now we need to start working on all of the different colored foliage that we have through here. And there's quite an interesting technique to a lot of it. There's kind of a spine, and then you have a lot of pieces that kind of move out to the side. I like it visually, but I feel like we don't necessarily have enough space to apply it accurately and properly on the size of canvas that we have. And that's something that's really important to consider that not a lot of people do. While something like this works in a photo because it can get that small, because of the grain in the canvas, that's not always achievable unless it has a massive amount of gesso. So we're going to change the actual type of foliage that we have in there to something that's a bit more consistent with everything else. But do consider the amount of detail you want to work with and the size of your canvas. If you're working on something like a 24 by 36, this would be very achievable. But on something the size of what we're working with today, I think that it really runs the opportunity, the risk of becoming messy, and we want to avoid that and get something that we know will work. So with that, I have some cadmium red light hue. You can see that right here. And we're going to start by grabbing it, moving it to a clean spot on our canvas, and this obviously isn't clean, but it's not wet. So we'll do that. We'll grab about 1/5 of it in Mars Black, and then we'll also grab about 1/8 of it in titanium white. We don't want too much titanium white. We don't want to turn it into a pink really quickly, but we do need to desaturate it. We'll go in for a test, and that actually looks really nice. I think that if it's a bit darker, it'll be just about right. So we'll grab some Mars Black, work that off to the side, and I'm going to keep the initial mixture because I do still really like it, and we might end up going with it, but this is definitely better. And then we also have this more orangey pigment throughout. So for that, we'll grab our red, grab our yellow, probably about double the amount of yellow to red, just because red is a stronger pigment. Titanium white. We'll go with an even mixture to the amount of red that we had. My brush is dirty. It does have a little bit of Mars Black in, but we'll add in some extra just in case. And it's not quite as bright, but I like it to begin with. And we can always go back and make a brighter version. So we have 3 different colors to play with. Let's go ahead, grab our liner brush, and add them in. Now, to begin here, I thought I'd actually show you what we see in the reference photo, just in case you are working on a larger canvas and you would like to explore it. I have a really small liner brush here, as you can see, probably the smallest brush I own. We'll grab some of our orange, and I'm going to find a relatively dark area just so this can stand out. You can really see it. We're going to start with a line for the body, and it'll kind of get lost in the foliage. And then we'll have all of these pieces that stick out from the side to varying degrees, nice and organic. Grab some extra water, because you really do need these applications to be sharp. And there we go. So just like that, we have some added detail. We were able to make it happen on the size of canvas that it is. It was iffy for sure. wasn't a guaranteed thing just because we don't have that much space. But you know what? It worked. Might as well follow through. But I'll also interject something a little bit easier. Something that's comes with security. Though now I think I'm going to do a combination of the two. So you don't have to, but recognize that it apparently is an option at this size, which is great. And in the future, when you are going to work on a painting and you can tell that the photo has a lot of detail in it, working with a larger canvas, while it will take you a lot longer, it will offer you additional opportunity to get things like this in really cleanly. And you can tell that I'm really trying to switch up the general movements. I did start by looking at the reference photo and just how these were all oriented. So this is sticking up, this kind of goes sideways and then droops down, this goes straight up, this goes down diagonally. Now it is going to get lost a little bit visually amongst the brighter foliage, but the hue will help it stick out to a point. There we go. Grab some more water. Up here we have a lot of really dark pigment, so it'll look very nice. We'll have some real contrast. There we go, and I'll do a second one. Probably, I was going to say relatively similar to that, but we don't want two so similar so close. So you know what? I think I'm just going to have it go the other way. Ideally, the majority of them are going this way, so they act as leading lines, moving the viewer into the painting. But you don't want them all to go that way or it looks really unnatural. Just going to go over that a couple times, throw in another one. There we go. We'll of course incorporate them on the other side so it's nice and cohesive. There we are. And ideally these ones are facing this way because, yet again, it's towards the center. So it switches depending upon which side of the canvas you're on. We'll have one coming in from off screen or from off of the canvas, just to make the world feel a little bit larger. We can have really small ones in the background here, just like that. And I'm going to go over this again because it's rather thin. There we go. So that worked well. Now we'll grab that same pigment and we'll just create something with 3 to 5 leaves. And this is your easier option. Right? It's just a couple taps with the smallest amount of drag. I kind of have one little piece that sticks up at the top, 2 that kind of hug it, and then 2 larger ones that are right down below. But you can really get creative with it, make it unique in your own. I'm not going to do too many of these because we have so many of the other at this point, but it is an option. Going back yet again, thickening the main portions just so they are less transparent. Now we'll grab some of our red, provided it hasn't dried, and we did get lucky. It has not. Now this is much needed at this point because we do have a lot of 2 colors, and I think this will make it all feel a whole lot more natural. It's very dark, and I did go with the lighter variant of the 2 for this first application. And for this, I think technique-wise, I'm going to go with a mixture of both of our last applications. So it's the longer spine, but then it's just a tap on either side. That way we have 3 different pieces. If you do too much, you can always go back and, of course, work the green or the darker value back on top. Relatively easy to work reductively here. Definitely starting to look more like the reference photo though, with some artistic liberties, of course. And I'm always trying to find a place to kind of tuck them behind wherever they're coming out of. So I'll find the top of a green piece and it'll go behind that. That way we have some extra very subtle depth. And I think I'll fill this area with a lot of them so it'll just become more of a general tap in the shadowy areas. So it'll stick out like the green, but we're creating it with the liner brush rather than the fan brush. Make a slightly brighter variant of it. Go back in, pick some of our favorites, give them additional highlight, especially the ones at the top because they will be receiving more light. There we go. We can definitely do a lot more with this, but I don't want to overdo it. And we still have a lot left to paint. So I think this is something we come back to at the end, should we feel we need it. That said, we'll also take some of that darker red, and maybe just splash a couple little pieces down here. Now, before we really continue onward here, I was looking back at the light that's coming down, and yet again, I wanted to increase it. However, I want to bring it over top the hill that we created right here, because realistically, this light is going to shine at a distance, but then it's also going to move forward and closer to us. And I want to reintroduce that dimension into the painting. We lost it a little bit with this, despite the fact that I do like the feature, and I think they can coexist quite well. So with that, we're going to create a bit of a larger beam of light. We're going to do that with this because as it gets closer to us, it'll look larger. So I'll make sure my brush is a little bit damp. Grab some clean titanium white, hint of our ultramarine blue, which has started to dry, a little difficult to get to, but we did get it. And of course the hint of Mars black. I do want to get the majority of the paint off the brush, so I'll just work that over here. And I'm actually going to start it at the bottom on top of some of the grass. There we go. You can use the side of the brush or the head of it. Going to wipe off little portions that are working in unfortunate ways with the tree. Work around it a little bit. And there we go. This is why we wanted to do the majority of the light before the trees, but this is to also note that it isn't the end of the world if you happen to do the tree and then you say, you know what, I kind of want to change that. I want something a little bit different. Can still work and can still work really well. There we go. Continuing to build up that top. And we'll just go through a couple of revisions. I know I'm getting a little quiet, but it is one of those times where we do need to focus and really consider our actions. There we go. Really like that. Really like that. And because we did cover quite a bit of that, I think the easiest way to go about it is when we're applying our highlights over here, we'll just go back and reapply those on top of the light. In some areas, we can also have it covering other portions to just give it even more dimension. But yeah, I think that worked really well. Applying it down here in the grass. Looks nice and bright. Almost has a bit of a glow to it. Just trying to keep these relatively straight, but again, you can do so with more certainty if you have painter's tape or something alike. But for now, I like it. We may go back yet again, but it does just keep getting better and better. Now, I was about to move on when I thought, you know what if we grabbed our round-headed brush and we just went to the base of a couple of these and we did a line that connected this top area down to the grass, and then we blended it back into the beam and we made the transition at the top really soft. So it's a bit of a gradient and it gets a little bit brighter as it hits the ground. I think that it's a really nice look. It's stark. It's something we shouldn't do too much of, but I think it really bridges the areas and makes the light look a lot stronger. And the light is a big part of this. Realistically, while we have a lot of detail here, the spectacle, the thing that's really special is the light. So going back and making it a bit more visually notable, not a bad call. There we go. Really, really lovely. on to the next step. Now we get to go back to something quite familiar, and that's the highlights that we have right behind this larger set of foliage and tree here. Because remember, this tree, it's backlit, so the edges are going to be the most thin. They have the less foliage, more light can work through them. And then as you move more so inwards, it gets more and more dark because that light it can't break through that many leaves. So we will get to create some depth, but yet again, we are mixing the pigment I believe we have right here. Now, everything on my palette has since dried, so don't have to worry too much about any of that. We're going in with a lot of our yellow, maybe half that with our sap green. Go in with an equal mixture of white to the sap green, and as you can see, it's very bright, but just a hint of Mars black will probably bring it right back down to where it should be. And just like that, it's actually a little bit darker than what we previously had, so a little more titanium white, and that looks just right. So we'll switch our brush and have some fun. Now for the actual application, we are going back to the softer fan brush, which I will dip in a little bit of water, wipe off the excess, and grab our new mixture. Now I'm going to begin right around the bottom area here, and we're going to work our way upwards, but I want to create essentially a transition between the hard line that we have with the canvas showing through and this nice blue lit area right through here. Now, you can move it in quite far because realistically, we're going to be covering a lot of this, if not all, a little bit later on with some darker pigments. But we need to ensure that the edges of our later created clusters have nice bright spots to show through. There we go. Lots of taps. Trying to be nice and original with it. As we do, we can have branches to kind of extend out later and connect them should we need them. And we are going to have additional clusters which come off of these branches. We're going to start by incorporating some of those now. Just make our job in the future a little bit easier. Don't need a massive amount, but something to build on top of will be useful. I'm going to grab some extra water. This one right here is also going to have quite a few nice little pieces of foliage, and it'll dip down, meet this spot right here. Have some really nice movement. And in the reference photo, there's a really large branch that works its way right through the middle of the sky here, essentially. And I don't know that I love it or want it at this point, so I'm going to paint without it, and we can go back and incorporate it if we feel the painting is missing it a little bit later on. So, for now, we'll just play it safe. Work in all of the areas that we know we need these. And now we have some falling pieces, which are kind of fun. There we go. Give it a little bit of wind. Now, we can switch back to our 1-inch brush. Grab some green, Mars black. Get a bit of a darker color going on here. We still have a lot of paint to work with, so we might as well not waste it. Go back to our fan brush, grab that, and start working on the inside here. We do want to ensure that we are still giving an adequate amount of paint though. We don't have to blend in with anything at this point, so we don't have to rush. Though you do see me doing this relatively quickly, simply because we are doing a lesson, and I don't want each portion to take too long for you. I know the video will be quite long, and I still want it to feel digestible. I know if you've watched to this point, you're probably someone who's quite interested in painting, and very dedicated to the craft and to learning and to getting better. But I still want to ensure that you're spending your time and learning in the process. So, with that, getting this nice little edge around here worked out, we're definitely going to have a lot of foliage out here, out here. Again, looking for the pre-established spots that I have, and I'm just kind of looking up at my reference photo, which I am deviating from as I noted, but it is giving me some framework, which is beneficial. And this one's going to come down like that. It's nice. I think we continue to get darker. I think that's the next step. More Mars black, more green, a little bit of titanium white, a little bit of our yellow, and back to the fan brush. Definitely getting darker. We are really in the foreground now though, so we want those stark applications. This is where we really have an opportunity to make the piece pop. And this will do a great job of doing it. Now, if the last set of greens that were applied are still a little bit wet, and therefore you're getting a blend here, that's actually not a bad thing at all. It can create a really nice look. So don't worry about that. Don't worry about breaking or having to wait. We'll grab a bit more. I'm hesitant to fill out these more so middle areas because I really want to see how the painting is balanced with all of this being as dark as it's going to be. So I'm not doing too much out here, but we will be going back and doing significantly more. So right now we're just filling in our negative space, covering a lot of our tree, but that's always okay. And this back area, hypothetically, isn't going to have a lot of range and value, but I'm still going to tap in all of the applications, which I will vary slightly. So, back to the 1 inch, add a bit more titanium white. Still want to keep it dark, but we'll create slightly more variance. And we'll just fill in all of the open spaces that are not the actual tree trunk and branches. We'll have it kind of get lost between the foliage. There we go. And we'll go back and we'll paint the actual tree over a lot of this. So don't worry about that. You can also blend with this brush. It's actually not inefficient at it. And I'm just looking for variety at this point. Now for this next step, I'm going to go back to the 1/3 inch filbert brush because it does have that nice sharp edge and it can hold a decent amount of paint. Now our subject here is the tree over on the left hand side. We know that we're going to need quite a bit of our burnt umber. We'll go in with probably an equal amount, if not a little bit more, Mars black, a hint of our titanium white, and from there we should have something very close to a black. Just a hint of color, a little bit of an earthy feel to it, and that right there I think will work great. So I'm going to mix up a bit more of it because we do have a lot to do, though I do think it's worth noting I am, again, repositioning a lot of these branches. You are more than welcome to do so in accordance with your foliage. Because of how we apply the foliage with all of that tapping, ours is probably going to look a little bit different and therefore require different branches, but we'll talk about why we're adding branches, where we're doing so, how we're doing so. That way you don't simply have to copy what I'm doing, but you have a good idea of how to go about it yourself, and not only just for this lesson, but for others as well. So from there, I'm going to grab my brush, make sure it's nice and damp. We're going to head into where we know this should be, and you can paint around some of the foliage that you've already done, or you can just go ahead and paint over top all of it. I like to do a little bit of a combination here, simply because when we paint around some of the green, it makes it look like that foliage is on top of our wood, and it's just going to make it a little bit more dimensional. Though we also want areas that are fully open, because realistically the foliage is, all the way around, but in certain areas it's going to be more visually open. We can also go back and cover up more of our tree with foliage should we want to. So we have a lot of option here, and it's really up to you and how much of the tree you want to show. I'm also trying to stop and let the foliage fully cover it, and then it'll re-emerge here, and then it'll probably stop again as it moves up. So a couple of different options. We can do a couple of taps in between, and we do need to do quite a few branches still. So for this, we're going to apply a very minimal amount of pressure because we don't want our bristles to expand. I'm going to bring this branch to right about here, and then you can see there's some fairly dense foliage, and you can tell it's dense by the fact that it's dark. So I'll say, okay, you know what? All of this branch right here is covered. I'll have it re-emerge over here. Maybe we'll make it a little bit more thick. And then we'll have it come back up through this spot, get lost between these, come back through there, and then you can see just little hints of it and the offshoots, all of the smaller branches just kind of coming off, and they don't all need to lead to clusters of foliage. Some of them can just be branches on their own, and that one breaks off over into there. It's all quite dark, so you don't see a lot of it in this space right now, and that's okay. I'm also changing my initial drawing to suit what we ended up randomly getting through the tapping motion, though I'm trying to keep the general idea of the composition in mind, because we did build the painting around a composition. There we go. This brush also, while it's good for this, it isn't perfect for the smallest of branches. So when you get to those, you might want to switch back over to the smaller liner brush. Whenever I see a really large opening, I like to add a little bit of a branch going through it, with a couple exceptions, just for randomization's sake. And you can always go back and add a cluster if you feel you need it. I added this branch right here because I felt there needed to be one, but it doesn't actually have any foliage. We can go back and we can add that on top. I do have a couple open spots on the canvas though that you might see, where we just don't have any paint at all, and those definitely need to be reapproached with a bit of green. So far though, really liking how it is. Very subtle. That's essentially what I wanted. And I think I'm actually going to do a second tree. It wasn't in the reference photo, but it'll connect almost to the bottom of this one, and it'll just get lost behind all of this foliage. So it's another leading line that brings you up into the painting, but isn't all that dramatic. We can grab some green, Mars black, titanium white, more Mars black, create a darker green, and with this I'll just fill in some of the openings that we still have. And we can paint over top some of our branches, including the actual body of the tree. Though if the green is different, ends up being different from a lot of the other greens that you have, do make sure to interject it in other areas just so it's all nice and cohesive. It's a word I'm sure you've heard 100 times in this lesson, but it's so important, and we need to think about it every step of the way. Here we're just painting on individual little leaves. You can do this with so many brushes, but the filbert is actually pretty great at it. Again, we're trying to see if we have to add in the larger branch in the middle, or if we're okay not doing so. I won't really know until we take a large step back, get full view of the painting, real context of what it looks like, and then, probably sit with it for a couple of minutes, imagine it in different states. Something else you can do if you have the program is Photoshop it in. I've done that with a number of lessons before. It takes quite a while, but again, able to do that thanks to you and your support, the fact that you're watching these videos, and everybody up over on Patreon. So thank you to everybody who does allow me to take the time to really work with these things like that. With one of the past paintings, I took out an entire sky, grabbed another reference photo, put that sky in, readjusted all of the hues and lighting so that it made sense, and it was taking so long, but it was, I think it was worth it. I think it turned out really, really well. And again, that's all thanks to the community that supports the channel, so thank you. With that, I'm really, really happy with this so far. I think I am going to take those steps back, see how it all works, and from there, perhaps we go in and add the larger middle piece, perhaps we don't. So after taking those steps back, I realized I actually really, really like the flow that we have. You can see that it kind of gets larger as it comes up, and then it drapes back down, and then it leads into these, which lead back up, and it's this cycle that keeps the viewer engaged. And I feel like if we kind of cut it off in the middle, we might not get that effect. So I'm actually very happy with the general movements, and I'm not going to opt to put the larger piece in the middle, though you are more than welcome to do so and cover up more of the sky. With that said, there is still some things to have fun with. I'm going to take our burnt umber, our titanium white, about an equal mixture, and then again an equal mixture of our Mars black, and we'll create a bit of a brighter, slightly more earthy version of what we have in the trees. And much like what we did over on the right hand side, we're just going to do an outline that then works its way inwards. You're not actually supposed to do outlines in painting. You want your values to distinguish your subjects, but we are working on the outskirts of the side that is facing the light, and I'm purposefully doing this very far away from the camera just so you know how subtle it is, especially in regards to everything else. And I'd recommend at this point in the painting, if you can, paint from quite the distance, because we are so close to that finish line, and you just want to ensure at this point that everything's working together as well as it possibly can. So far, really like that. Nice and subtle. We'll work our way up. And generally I recommend doing a start and stop motion with these applications. So rather than doing one elongated stroke, it's, 5, where you just have these little breaks, and that way you have these inconsistency, the branch feels a little more natural. I really, really like that look. Also, if you move into the branch a little bit, that's also not an issue, because there could be grooves and protruding areas that stick out, catch light, and that light works its way on that groove inwards, and so the majority of the branch doesn't have that highlight, but that one little area does, and it's just a really nice touch. That said, here yet again, I'm using my pinky finger to ground my hand in the process and eliminate some shake. It has been quite a few hours since I've braked to eat, so I am a little bit more shaky than I normally am. And this is a friendly reminder to you that in the painting process, especially in these longer lessons, make sure that you are taking breaks, have some water, have some food, make sure that you are nice and healthy through it, because if you're anything like me, you can get distracted for hours and just paint and have fun with it and figure things out. And I know that the actual lesson isn't extremely long, but in, between all of these clips, I am trying different things and, have a spare canvas to work on, and just, the time adds up. So do make sure that in the process you are making sure your body has what it needs. But with that, I really like these. I don't want to overdo it. I think I'm going to stop there. It's a little bit less saturated than what we have over here, a little bit less warm. That is intentional because this area is actually receiving a little bit of light where this isn't at all. It just gets a little bit of that reflective light that comes back and therefore isn't going to be as warm or bright. With that though, I'm actually going to grab the other fan brush, should I be able to find it. We have a goal, we have a mission. Where did I put it? Oh, I see it. Sorry for blocking the view there. We have the older, more stiff fan brush here. So we've been working with two. We've been using the soft one for quite a lot. Again, it kind of bunches up, great for creating the larger foliage. This one, great for the more detailed areas like the grass, and then we did go back in there. I'm going to continue with this, and you can actually blend quite well with it. Grab some titanium white, some of our blue, about an equal mixture of those two, by the way. And then for the green, I'm just going to grab about a third. Maybe make it a bit brighter. Maybe make it a bit more yellow. So make it about a sixth of the green. And I'm going to go back in and continue to add some highlights to this tree now that I know that I'm not going to rely on extra branches to create a lot of that interest. We need to make this pop to a slightly greater degree. Just add some extra detail in there. So far, so good. We can add it to the edges, creating and building on our clusters. I'm going to take a little bit of a step back, like that a lot. We can also add this to the edges of our new tree, and in some of the larger openings where that light will work its way through. There we go. Now the two sides really feel like they fit together as you want them to. And we can have a couple little areas that peek out and catch some light through the openings. There. Yeah, that's a really nice touch. We can also go down to the bottom and continue to brighten that should we want to. I think we'll make it even more yellow. There we are. Oh, that's a really nice highlight. Really bright, really warm. Spread it out just a little bit, but not too much. Create some inconsistency by rotating the brush. Add a hint over in that patch, a hint over in that patch. And it's really coming together. It went through some quite awkward stages, but it's really coming together. Actually, you know what? We generally have a code word for those of you who make it to the end of the videos. I can see in my analytics that often it's only between 8 and 13%, and it makes sense. They're fairly long videos. You know, not everybody has time to finish, but for those of you who do, we like to give out a little word, a little subtle badge of honor. You can incorporate that word in the comments down below, and I and everybody else who got to the end will know that you were one of the few, one of the 8 to 13% who really was invested in, doing all that you can to become better at the craft. But I think the word for today is progress. Yeah, I was thinking about how I went through all of those awkward stages, and we kind of had to trust the process, and I think process is the word. So you can either put that in the comments or you can work it into a sentence, but just a fun little way of noting that you did make it this far. And also, if you made it this far, thank you for just being here. Thank you for being a part of the channel, being a part of the community. I know that a lot of people stop in, and we do have a great core group that does watch the full thing and is there. So thank you. Thank you for being a part of that. I love that we've been able to build this community into what we have over the years, and it's people like you that really make it special, right? So thank you. Also, yet again, big thank you to our patrons who directly support the channel, make lessons like this happen. I say it all the time, but the channel is essentially community funded, and the community is you. So thank you for letting me spend as much time as I do on these. Again, photoshopping the images and sometimes combining them, doing painting sometimes 2-3 times just to get it right, or teach it right. Sometimes I find I really end up liking the end result of the painting, but I realize I could have gone back and in step 16 say, do that better. And I was like, okay, well, we'll find a couple other things to improve, and we'll go back and we'll just redo the lesson. Thank you for letting me do that. I feel like it ensures that I'm able to continuously make work that I'm proud of and put out lessons that I'm proud of, and I only have that time and flexibility because of you. So big thank you. If you are new to the channel and this is your first time here, you can check out the Patreon. It's linked in the description, but that's where you do get the traceables, the reference photos. You can get all of my ebooks, including Acrylics for Beginners, which is essentially the essentials, everything you need to know about acrylic painting before you jump into it. You can get the ebooks full of traceables. We have an exclusive Facebook group where everybody shares their work, and it's a great place to learn because you see different iterations of the paintings that are up here on the channel. Bunch of fun stuff. So if you're interested in any of that, do go ahead and check it out, or if you just want to support the channel. But I also get comments of people saying, I really want to, but I can't right now, I can't afford it. If that's you, don't worry about it. It's okay. We have a great community who is taking care of us, and I recognize that it's not all the time that we can do that sort of thing. So I hope you enjoy the fact of the lessons up here. And I thank you for just being here regardless. But with that, I'm really happy with this. I know I could continue painting it for hours and just doing little tweaks and touch-ups here and there, but the painting's essentially done, and I'm very happy with it. So thank you for being here. Thank you for being a part of the community, for making this with me. I hope that you have wonderful success with it. I hope that you're able to take a lot of the ideas that we incorporated here and work them into your own pieces in the future. And I hope that you have a great time. So thank you. I will see you soon with a brand new painting lesson. And above all, as always, stay creative.